Thanks for tuning in to the OCCRL Equity Eye Opener webinar series. This virtual brown bag series is a professional development tool that provides dialogues on equitable practices with the goal of promoting courageous conversations and activist leadership around pervasive tensions and race relations within community colleges. The series features educational leaders, scholars, and practitioners from the Advancing Racial Justice and Equitable Outcomes in Community Colleges Institutes. These individuals are experts in advancing inclusive campus climates and racial equity. We hope you enjoy this talk.
Hello, and this webinar is titled Equity's Unspoken Dilemmas, Setting Priorities for Racial Justice. My name is Heather McCambly. I'm a PhD candidate at Northwestern University. I'm also a consultant with the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. And in a past life, I was a full-fledged member at OCCRL. And I'm so excited to be back as part of the Equity Eye Opener webinar series. And this talk was originally given as part of the Advancing Racial Justice and Equitable Outcomes in Community College Institute. So I will jump right in. So first of all, the content of today's webinar is actually based on a brief that's available on the OCCRL website for free, also titled Equity's Unspoken Dilemmas. And a number of the reflections and exercises, as well as some more in-depth information related to what I'm going to share, is available in this brief. So that might be helpful if you're watching this webinar as part of a facilitated group oriented activity. I don't know why that's hard to get out of my mouth. So phrases like we're committed to equity, or we strive to close equity gaps in student outcomes, or our college is committed to an equitable and inclusive environment probably sound very familiar to those of you watching this webinar, whether you're working in a community college or you're working in a research environment focused on community colleges. But what do these phrases really mean when rubber hits the road? We know that equity can take many different forms. Our definitions can vary broadly. And in many fields, including in higher education, focused on community colleges and other types of institutions, we hear a lot of arguments about what it'll take to, quote, move the needle on equity. And one of these arguments is rhetorical, like this one here. Equality is about sameness. It focuses on making sure everyone gets the same thing, but equity is about fairness. It ensures that each person gets what he or she needs. Higher education must focus on equity to make the most empowering forms of college learning available to all students. Such an approach begins with equity-minded leaders who make it a priority to build new opportunities for students of color. These types of arguments, this one was taken from a guide called Step Up and Lead for Equity, published by the Association of American Colleges and Universities, which draws heavily on Dr. Estela Ben-Simone's intellectual work on equity-mindedness. These type of arguments can be placed in the world of social movements, policy, and racial framing literatures that really speak to this idea of framing, or that what we mean or how we define this idea of equity matters to the futures of students and the colleges that we work in. What that means is we can kind of play out this idea of how equity matters and how defining equity matters in terms of a logic model. So this logic model, which is part of the brief that I mentioned previously, demonstrates how equity definitions form a foundation from which we frame problems, develop solutions, and measure our outcomes as educators in community colleges. So take a moment here to reflect, or if you're going through this webinar, feel free, as a group, feel free to pause and share about your reflection. What are the key components of your personal definition for equity and how to achieve it, and why? Again, I'm going to assume that you'll pause if you need more time to think through that. So before going further, I'll offer a quick roadmap. I am going to offer an empirical research case from my own research that surfaces some of the real and measurable effects of varied equity framings and the dilemmas that we face when we craft those frames. Then I offer a series of prompts and questions for servicing the tensions and the trade-offs to help us make more strategic and aligned choices about how we use and mobilize ideas about equity in our own educational spaces and our own pedagogies. So first, I started with a question in my own research project. Do frames affect how leaders intervene in educational problems? So educational leaders often intervene to either support or change existing processes in a field, particularly in community colleges, and often do so with interest in reducing social inequality. So as a researcher, I'm pulling from literatures in political science, social psychology, cultural sociology that all highlight the crucial role of what we call framing for motivating the work we do, whether we're administrators, part of a social movement, or a policy leader. And in particular, this is relevant in terms of how we frame race as something that fits into the work that we do. For example, one key contradiction in this area is that elite, well-resourced, and white institutions of higher education are the primary beneficiaries of philanthropic dollars intended to intervene in the higher education sector, even though these are not the institutions that predominantly serve underrepresented minority students. So we know little about how leaders' stances embodied in equity frames really materially affect or not patterns of resource distribution related to protecting or reducing educational inequality. And again, here's just some definitional work I'm doing about how frames operate to specify target populations. So who are we trying to increase equity for? Who needs this equity that we're talking about? Problem diagnoses, how is equity or inequity being driven? And promoted solutions, what should we do about it? And as I said, we know little about how these stances really affect outcomes. So put another way, if I as an educator believe that rising tides lift all boats, which is one way of understanding a colorblind or race evasive stance on equity, in what ways are my intervention strategies different than if I took a stance that water levels are not the problem, but that some people, perhaps based on racial categories, have never been allowed to put their boat in the water at all? We can think of this as a metaphor for race-conscious framing. It is an empirical question whether and how such stances affect policy outcomes, and one that is often taken for granted. So the study, I'm going to give a really quick overview here where I tried to operationalize this discussion, this idea of, does a change in equity framing affect the distribution of dollars, grants for educational improvement? And specifically, is there an effect on distributions that would benefit underrepresented minority and poor students? So I did a mixed method study to address this question, particularly in the context of a federal grant-making organization called the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, a foundation-like federal agency tasked for 40 years with awarding innovation grants to improve higher education and reduce inequality. So to test this question, I isolated a case, FIPSI, as I said, that had a distinct shift in its equity framing in 2013 under the Obama administration. And I discovered through in-depth interview data, as well as policy review, that this shock really came from the Obama administration into FIPSI. So it didn't come as a result of staff turnover or slow change over time, but really as an immediate framing change from the administration onto FIPSI as an agency. This gave me an opportunity to say, is this framing not necessarily a change in formal kind of law or policy or staffing, but just framing going to have an effect on who gets funded? Again, you can write to me to request this paper, but I did an analysis over the course of 20 years of archival documents, specifically grant guidelines, to establish that my observation was in fact accurate, that for a long period of time leading up to this change, the agency was operating on a colorblind or race evasive frame of equity or equality that speaks about equality or diversity in very broad terms, but does not center issues of racial identity. And then the shift in the post period, where issues of race and other forms of identity inequity are really centered in the equity frame. And so I take that change, that framing change, that shift towards racial justice as a natural experiment to look at the impact of this frame change on the distribution of money to colleges and universities. This is what the model looks like. It's called a difference in difference strategy of causal inference. Again, I can talk more about this to anybody who's interested. But the idea is I'm trying to figure out if this policy change had an effect on who gets money. So for example, as you can see here in this visual, the two lines that you're looking at are FIPSE and then the TRIO Student Support Services program over time. So you can see that they were tracking pretty well over time. The Student Support Services grant program was pretty typically giving more money than FIPSE, which is that lower line, to minority serving institutions. And in fact, minority serving institutions were far less likely to be getting dollars from FIPSE over a long period of time, over at least 15 years, than white serving institutions. And this radically changed in the post period after this racial justice framing. And the same thing happens here amongst high Pell serving institutions. So the pattern had been that TRIO Student Support Services had absolutely awarded more money over time than FIPSE had to high Pell serving institutions. But this was again reversed in the post period in a way that can only really be explained by this policy change. So there's a trade-off here that I want to highlight, that the race evasive or the colorblind all students definition of advancing equity drastically favored the delivery of aid to do educational innovation work to whiter, wealthier institutions, despite the commitment to promoting equality. There is ample research across domains that tells us in the US context, this is exactly what we would expect. And this stems from psychological and sociopolitical forms of bias. The trade-off when we just say inequality or improvement or something like all lives matter, we can predict that the status quo, particularly the status quo that benefits white students or white organizations, will be supported by the actions that follow. But what about other measures? So what I just showed you demonstrated that there's a pretty strong causal change that occurred in the delivery of dollars to minority serving institutions and to high Pell serving institutions. But there are a lot of other measures of colleges and universities that are correlated in important ways with these constructs. So I want to use these measures to more deeply interrogate the different facets of this change and to also think of it as a bit of a falsification test of my results. So I'm just going to give you a few examples here. So first, we can look at this in terms of grants awarded to institutions in terms of their endowment. So if you see here, looking in terms of low endowment, we see that FIPSE tracks consistently below higher endowment colleges and even lower than the control group, Student Support Services, on this measure. And looking at high endowment institutions, we see the reverse. FIPSE tracks here well above zero and above the control group, meaning that the wealthiest institutions, the highest endowment institutions, are much more likely both before and after the policy change to receive even more money from this FIPSE program. So neither of these changes shows any neither of these measures shows any significant change from the policy frame change in question. And moreover, perhaps more concerning, this figure shows the relative funding awarded to associate granting colleges. Think of your local community college as an example. So we see that FIPSE tracked consistently and significantly below the comparison program prior to the policy change in giving money to community colleges. And there's actually a significant dip to more than $20,000 less per community college and net negative in the post period. Similarly, at Carnegie doctoral granting research universities, putting aside the significant shift back in 2005, which was caused by a different policy, we don't see any difference in FIPSE's preference for doctoral granting research universities over 2- or 4-year non-research institutions. And in the very narrow measure here, we see that US News top 100 universities relative to the rest of the college population. This is a population of the wealthiest, most prestigious institutions, which is less than 1% of the overall post-secondary landscape. that once again, they did not receive less funding under the new FIPSI conditions. And this is the strange thing, the puzzle. So did the racial framing change disrupt or preserve inequitable investment? So if we look descriptively at the proportion of the college population served by doctoral granting universities, almost 22%, while the total proportion of underrepresented minority students enrolled in these colleges is only 15%. In contrast, associate granting colleges serve 40% of the population of currently enrolled students, and actually 43.8% of underrepresented minority students. They are actually over-enrolling these students. So the pattern here is that MSI status aside, the types that show persistently higher funding from FIPSI over time, the 3 X's here, are the very institutions that do not serve a higher proportion of underrepresented minority students in both the pre and post period. Indeed, less than 10% of doctoral universities are MSIs, while over 30% of associate granting colleges are. This presents something of a puzzle, given the first figures we went through this presentation, and how can we understand this trend? So in these figures, I actually went ahead and intersected this idea of college type with MSI status. And you can see pretty quickly here that the bump we're seeing in terms of how many dollars are delivered to minority serving institutions is all occurring within minority serving doctoral universities. So think UT Austin, Howard, or many of the University of California system. But who isn't receiving benefit are places like Maricopa Community College in Arizona. So what does this mean, or how do we make sense of this? The racial justice frame did not affect the entire profile of resource distribution. Colleges and universities with more resources and more prestige had a historically positive correlation with receiving more grant benefits. This was not significantly changed or was even made worse in the post period. In this organizational population, this is a puzzle, as these types of colleges predominantly, the types that predominantly serve poor students and students of color, are historically and persistently disadvantaged in the receipt of FIPSI funding. So why? I'm going to go ahead and point to another qualitative analysis I did here, and we see that not only did FIPSI shift from a colorblind or race evasive frame to a racial justice frame, but the way they implemented their policies also changed. So they went from unrestricted design standards, you could really propose any kind of grant, very low accountability, surveillance, and evidentiary standards. They weren't having to do RCTs, very low kind of evaluation budgets required, and a broad funding distribution plan. So lots of grants to lots of places. However, in the new regime that focused on racial justice, suddenly the design standards were very restricted and very focused on issues of remediation, of fixing individual students, with very high accountability, surveillance, and evidentiary standards, meaning applicants had to come in with either quasi-experimental or experimental designs and really high standards of evidence in advance that what they were going to propose to do would work for their population of students. And a narrow funding distribution plan. These grants were expensive because of all of this accountability and surveillance required. So less institutions got more money, not necessarily to serve more students. So while on one hand, we can see this as a positive, when we focus on racial justice, we also want to see outcomes and we want to really be held accountable to that. However, those same features of the ability to put together review or evidentiary or bodies of evidence in advance, as well as to put together an RCT plan or other quasi-experimental evidence, is also highly correlated with the types of universities that have full-time grant writers, as well as that are heavily research focused, as opposed to community colleges, which are focused on community teaching and classroom work. And I apologize. This is the time of COVID and my child is crying in the background. So I apologize that I'm stuttering here a bit. So the implications here, equity frames matter to the development of intervention programs and to the distribution of money. We can show statistically significant effects in terms of how grant dollars are reaching poor and underrepresented minority students. But these effects can be accompanied by unintended consequences that replace rather than eliminate modes of racial stratification. These results would not necessarily produce the types of innovations we would think would change race-based inequalities. And defining equity is both about who we center, so this shift from colorblind to racial justice, and also how we define these priorities and the way we intend to accomplish equity. So this issue of kind of the trade-offs and the tensions is captured in the brief that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. As we think about this top row of this visual is something that we often focus on when we think about our equity definitions and equity framing and equity lenses and all other forms of equity that we discuss, which is, are we thinking about all students? Or are we thinking about some students and students who have been sociopolitically, socio-culturally positioned as minoritized in higher education? But there is also all of these other elements that really affect the impact of an equity frame. And so in the race evasive era of FIPSE's work, they were focused on all students. They focused on innovation projects as opposed to evidence-based projects, which means trying something new as opposed to trying something already tested. They focused on very low evaluation investment, so they were able to put funds straight into programming, and the bar to getting a grant was much lower in terms of evaluation planning. They focused on systemic or organizational change in the university, and they focused on changing the quality of the educational experience in particular. And in the racial justice period, while the focus really did shift to some students, meaning really narrowing in on students who had been structurally disadvantaged by higher education structures over time, these other elements shifted. We saw a shift to evidence-based projects, to high evaluation investment, to individual or direct service changes rather than kind of organization level changes. And we really saw this shift to focusing on quantities in terms of bodies in, bodies out, rather than the quality of the experience. And I say none of this in a normative way to suggest that it should be quality over quantity, or we should be focusing on organization rather than direct service, but rather to point out that all of these elements have trade-offs, and reckoning with these trade-offs can have important benefits to this idea of an equity lens. So in other webinars and materials featured on this website, we've discussed the role of implicit bias in affecting decision and judgments we make in everyday interpersonal interactions. But here we can start to see how the choices we make about how to structure policy or educational environments for different students also brings with it particular dilemmas, and at times ways that our implicit bias becomes structural bias as we assume things about what one population needs over another to achieve equity. So at this point, if you're going through this webinar as a group or just as an individual, there'll be a couple of opportunities to pause and work through some thoughts. So following this discussion and this idea of trade-offs and this idea of your equity lens encompassing much more than just who you center, but how and how you're going to implement that, go ahead and revisit your thoughts on the key components of your personal definition for equity and how to achieve it. What do you notice was not part of your definition and why? And in this yellow box on the right, you can think about some of these trade-offs highlighted in the brief and over this webinar in terms of who equity is focused on, what you know about why the inequities are there to begin with, how you'll measure change, what you should do to achieve it, if it's most important in particular programs of study, who should be responsible, the role of accountability and accountability to whom. And how do we use resources to achieve this vision of equity? And you can go ahead and pause for as long as you'd like to consider these questions as an individual or as a group. Moving to a second round of reflection, I want to ask you to consider how your institution formally defines equity, and how this looks different from your personal definition. Moreover, how do you find your institution informally defines equity? So formally we can think about on paper, but informally we might say in practice. Are these definitions different? How and why? And do these definitions differ from your personal stance? And after you've paused and kind of reflected on these formal and informal definitions of equity and thoughts and concerns you're having, I want to ask you to think about these and look at these definitions in terms of tensions and trade-offs. So the tensions would be, what does not align across definitions? If we want to achieve a certain type of educational equity, how are definitions supporting that vision or not? Or what doesn't show up in some definitions that seems important to achieving racial justice? What are the trade-offs to these tensions? So what specifically do you gain or lose in efforts to achieve racial justice by the current definitions and tensions? For example, one conversation I know going on in a lot of communities is many visions of systemic equity change center the idea of top-down policy change. But a lot of top-down actors, whether we're thinking at the top of institutions or at the top of state higher education systems, have long been white dominated and dominated by folks who have been part of the higher education system for a very long time. So that's one vision and one possibility for system change, but the other might be more of a grassroots and political mobilization approach among students, but also among faculty, among staff, among communities interested in what happens in your local community college. And again, there are tensions and trade-offs between both these top-down and bottom-up approaches. And a lot of this can come down to what best aligns with the type of transformative, equity-oriented change you're looking for, and really testing out the limits of the different theories of change. So back to trade-offs, how do the implicit biases that your institution holds about what minoritized students need or lack play in here? What needs to change to better align your college's actions with racial justice outcomes? And what needs to change to serve the needs and desires of your students? And a few last thoughts on what you can do. In the live version of this last summer, we talked about steps, big and small, that we could take to mobilize towards a more racially just equity focus. We talked about identifying allies and choir. Allies being those who are ready to mobilize but maybe don't know how yet, and the choir being your equity champions on campus who are always bringing these issues up in meetings and are organizing and are well networked. And then the resistors or defiers, so those who are a little less friendly to this work. So how can you empower and organize your allies and choir, and how can you redirect others maybe to other work? Name the venues in which you could start a dialogue about these tensions and trade-offs, and go deeper than just saying we all agree to an equity lens, but saying how are we going to operationalize that and what are the trade-offs? Name a public institutional goal or belief you could hook into that could motivate the adoption of a racial justice paradigm. And also think about what stands in the way. What else do you need to do this work? How do you push racial justice in an environment where you know it could activate white fragility? This conversation initially occurred in the summer of 2019. Now in the summer of 2020, I think the conversation has shifted drastically in terms of how open different types of actors in a cross-section of the US are to talking about racial justice. So while I haven't changed this presentation, I certainly hope that the openness on campuses is shifting on this topic. And so with that, I want to thank you and again mention that more in-depth information is available in the brief on the OCCRL website. And just I want to thank Dr. Ebony Zamani Gallagher and her entire wonderful staff for allowing me to record this webinar and to share with a broader audience. I would love to hear from you. mccambly@u.northwestern.edu. Thanks.
Thank you for joining. We appreciate your interest in advancing inclusive campus climates and racial equity. We encourage you to listen to our other Equity Eye-Opener webinars, which are available on the OCCRL website. Just look for the project page labeled Advancing Racial Justice and Equitable Outcomes in Community Colleges Institutes.